Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode.
Hi everybody, and hi Steph. How are you feeling about yourself today?
Are you asking me?
Mm-hmm.
Decent. Good. Hopeful.
Good.
You?
Pretty similar. I'm quite excited because next week I'm coming to see you in person. But by the time this comes out, that would have been several weeks ago.
Oh, that's right. I was like, you're telling them now?
Well, they're not going to hear it till afterwards.
Right.
We've kind of kept it quiet, but that is exciting, I think. I'm excited about it. But today we thought we would talk a bit about bulimia, more specifically, because we talk about disordered eating on a spectrum, really, on this podcast. And we've had a few requests to talk about bulimia specifically. And I know, Steph, you certainly struggled with bulimia. I've also experienced bulimia. And it's interesting, though, that when you and I are often talking in previous episodes about our eating disorders, we don't tend to mention bulimia.
I know.
Why do you think that is?
I always just identified with the binge eating part.
Same.
I felt like I was a fraud bulimic, even though I was bulimic.
Need to trigger warnings. I mean, hopefully it's self-evident from the title.
Yeah.
But we're going to talk about bulimia. We don't know where this conversation is going to go. Chances are there might be some quite graphic descriptions. We'll see if that's tricky for some people. You might want to go back and listen to another episode. If they don't want to listen to this one, what episode would you suggest they listen to?
I'll go to number 1. But if you've already listened to number 1, what's one of my faves? Humility.
Humility. Okay. I liked humility as well. Okay, back to you trying to make yourself sick.
I couldn't make myself purge and felt like a failed bulimic. I was at the point at that time where I had been anorexic for a period of time, and then I started binging. And then it was like, that went on long enough, and I was like, I need to do something about this. Because I couldn't, for some reason, get back to anorexia. Like I tried, but I couldn't. And I know why now, but anyway, moved into binge eating. So then it was like, well, it's time for me to purge. I need to do that. And you know what else? I don't know if you ever experienced this, but the reason that this even came into my head was because I had to do a report on it in English in my junior year of high school. It was like this educational series on eating disorders in adolescence. And I was like, great, lots of new ideas. Like all those after school specials that are meant to caution young girls only inspired me. So I remember doing this report on it and attempted to purge, couldn't purge, felt awful about that. It was like something was wrong with my body that it wouldn't allow me to. So what I ended up buying laxatives and ipecac syrup and all of these other alternative ways of compensating, and exercise and fasting. So that became my bulimic in the beginning. And later I did figure out how to purge, and that became like another thing I would do. But by and large, I would still say that it was binging that was the predominant behavior, and I would purge, but it wasn't as consistently as I would binge.
Mm-hmm. I feel something very similar. I think I also had that experience of feeling like I just wasn't a very good bulimic, because I always found purging very difficult. And when I figured out how to do it, I still never felt like I was really able to fully purge. So I felt like I was just taking the edge off, and that made me feel like I wasn't getting it quite right as well. I do think it's worth just mentioning before we go on that in terms of what bulimia actually is, because most people think bulimia is just making yourself sick after eating. And a lot of people don't even know that bulimia includes binge eating, because if you're not binging and if you're just being sick after eating regular meals, that actually isn't bulimia. That can be like an atypical anorexia if most of the time you're restricting and you're not eating the large quantities of food. And of course, compensatory behaviors isn't necessarily just being sick. It can be exercise, fasting, like you mentioned, and laxatives, again, like you mentioned, all of which I have done at different times.
I think about that. I think of my mom catching me like with 2 boxes of laxatives. and my face turning gray. Like my skin color turned gray. And I remember my mom, that's how my mom knew that I was doing that. That was her like telltale. And one time she caught me. One time I was in the bathroom purging and I walked out into my bedroom and there she was because the bathroom was attached to it. It was like a Jack and Jill bathroom and she was there, like had been listening.
Mhm.
As a mom, I think about this whole thing differently at the time. I thought she was annoying and violated me and got in my way. But now, God, um, I also really think that when I would purge, there was so much anger because there is such a violence in purging behavior sometimes. Such an expulsion when we're talking about purging, even laxatives. Fasting, it's a bit different, but the compensatory exercise as well. There's something so active and violent, I think, about it. And it's a feeling. And I remember when I would get so angry that I did not know what to do with it, like it couldn't be contained inside of me anymore. I needed to release it. Our emotions are energy and they do need to come out. And I use this in physical form now in movement. But at the time, I didn't have any. I just needed to do. I needed to, blah, like literally, right? I needed that feeling of that. And it was in this way at certain times where my emotions were that high, there was something about that act that was, and I thought that was just about, okay, the calories are out.
Mhm.
I've made up for them. But I also see it as an actual physical release of pent up energy. Um, that I still experience the need to have that energy move somewhere now. And I can understand why that was what I thought to do because it also got rid of the calorie. Well, I mean, in theory, I just think with bulimia in those forms of purging that it can be such a cry for such a representation of emotions that are so pent up that need to get out, literally.
Mm. I remember the first time I purged was about 9 months after my binge eating had started. And I remember the moment after I purged, feeling that sense of relief of going, this is bulimia. Because I'd been so confused about my binge eating. I had done quite a bit of research and I'd found out about this binge eating disorder. But that was back in, 2009, I think, 2008, 2009. And so there wasn't really much known about it. It wasn't even a standalone eating disorder in the DSM at that point. So when it became, in my mind, bulimia from that moment, I thought, okay, I've got a name, I've got a proper name for this now. So now I can find out about bulimia and figure out how to fix it. I think the thing that took me by surprise was once I started purging, I had no idea how difficult it would be to stop because I feel like even more so than the binge eating, my rational mind would be like, well, just stop doing this thing. Like at any point, you should be able to stop. And thinking for a long time that I could, and then a few times really making the effort to just stop and not being able to. And that was pretty frightening at that point when it felt that out of control. And I suppose the difference that I really felt when the bulimia was very bad is with the binge eating, there's the stopping point. There is a point where you absolutely cannot eat anymore. Whereas with bulimia, you can purge and carry on eating again. And I didn't do that many times, more than once in a day, but I did go through a period of time where I was doing that. And that was actually after my mum died, and I didn't see the connection. Like,
Yeah.
I really didn't see the connection between having lost my mum and my bulimia being worse. I just couldn't put the two together. I think when you're in it,
Mm-hmm.
it's so chaotic. I mean, binge eating is chaotic, and the purging just brings in another layer of
Mm-hmm.
chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I would say over the next few years, there'd be times when the bulimia was much reduced, and I wouldn't always purge when I binged as well, which is another reason why I thought I was a failed bulimic. And I remember once somewhere someone was talking about bulimia, and they were saying how you do have control over your binges because if you couldn't purge, then you don't binge, do you? And I was thinking, no, I do still binge. And
Absolutely.
sometimes I can't purge. But it was suggesting that, and then exactly that was a reason for feeling like I must be a failed
Yeah.
bulimic. I can't remember where it was, but I feel like it was in something quite official that I heard that.
Oh, that's a shame.
Hmm.
I feel like I purged in a lot of ways to give myself a validated eating disorder because again, binge eating disorder wasn't. So I felt like to make it more real, I had to be purging. Like that would make my parents take me more seriously, and myself. I took it more seriously. Like I have an actual eating disorder. I'm not just gluttonous. But with purging, the thing for me is actually, I don't think I ever purged and stopped. I purged just to eat again. And that sort of deterred me from it after a while, because it was like, there's no point in this. I'm not purging and then moving on. I'm binging and purging just to make more room. And I think I needed that heaviness in my stomach. I needed that absolute fullness in my stomach. So when I purged, it, then I needed it again. Um, so to me, the whole thing was a mess. I just felt like I wasn't doing it right, and it wasn't working, and wasn't worth the trouble out for me after a while. I don't remember feeling like, oh my gosh, I really, really can't stop. I just went through periods of time where it would be daily, multiple times daily, through periods of time where I just was like, I can't be bothered. There's no point. I'm just going to keep binging anyway. But again, the places where it arose were always times of high stress or high emotion. And I think that's the other reason why it doesn't feel in the moment like you can connect it to your life event, because it really feels about the food.
Yes.
Like I remember in the moment, it was just like, no, it's not about I really didn't like when people said that. It pissed me off when therapists would be like, what else is going on? And it was like, no, it isn't. I swore up and down. It wasn't about that. It was simply about my weight. Like that was a separate issue. And so to me, it was like really hard for me to see it as a response to heightened emotion.
Yeah. For me, there was a period of time where it was very attached to emotion. And then it just didn't seem to be doing so much in that department. And what I noticed, maybe slightly similar to you, was that I found out I could see that whenever I'd had a day where I'd binged and purged, I could never go from a day of purging into a day that I back then would have called a good day. I never went from purging to that. It would always be purging, binging, binging, bit less binging, and then maybe I get a few days respite. I never went from purging into a respite. Something clicked for me where I could really see how the purging itself was making the problem worse. Because for quite a few years, I didn't see that, because I thought, well, I'm going to binge anyway, whether I purge or not.
Right.
So I might as well purge and feel a little bit more comfortable. That was a point that really helped me to get to a place, and it felt like this decision. And even though after I'd made the decision that I wasn't going to do it anymore, I think maybe I did it 2 or 3 times after that, pretty spaced apart. And I remember the last time that I binged and purged, I'd read something somewhere. I was reading someone's story, and it was a story about bulimia, and they were talking about how they would purge. They talked about the ritual of laying the towel on the floor and this, that, and the other, and what they would go through. And this is going to sound so strange. I don't even know how to make sense of it now. But I then went and did the same thing, and I didn't even purge in the position that I normally positioned myself in, because I would normally be standing and leaning forward. I wouldn't normally be on my knees.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was very strange. And like, while I was doing it, I thought, this is really odd. I haven't done this for a long time. And why does this feel so wrong? Oh, because I'm not even in the position I'm normally in. And talk about a trigger, because that's what it was.
Mm.
And I don't think I'd ever appreciated up until that point what triggers had the capacity to do. And I've never really been able to make sense of that last time, why I did it then. And I remember thinking as well, because I'd never done it in that particular place I was living at the time. So that felt like a bit of a blow. But there was no part of me that then was tempted to go back to it. It really was the most, I wanted to say, disappointing experience, but quite often afterwards, the bit that often doesn't get spoken about is after you purge, there's that sense of calm that comes, like the nervous system can feel reset. And I didn't get that at all the last time I did it. So maybe there was just part of me that needed to have that experience so that I've never had to fight with that again. There've been 1 or 2 times where it's come in as a thought, oh, I could do this, but then it's gone. It's never felt like anything that's got its claws in me or is actually got any sort of power or oomph behind it,
Yeah, that's interesting.
Mm.
So that was the last time. How much longer after that did you recover?
So this was when I was I wasn't recovered, but I was kind of in a much better place with food. I was moving in and out of recovery. So I would say that must have been 2022. That would have been 5 years ago, I think maybe, would have been the last time I purged. So it would have been sort of right towards, so maybe I was in a different place with food anyway.
Yeah.
I certainly don't think there was any
Yeah.
restriction around, so that wouldn't have been part of it at that point.
Yeah. I had that experience as well, as where the height of the bulimia had been behind me, but there were like these times in the end where I would do it so interesting once again that you were disappointed in yourself for doing it. It was a blow, you said. And to me, it was like, I still got it. Like, I thought it was a badge of honor. And I also remember doing it in the context of clean eating, where if I ate something processed, I needed to get it out because it was, tainting me, tainting my perfect health.
Yeah. Much better for your health to be sick.
Right?
Yeah.
But I also remember doing it as a way of putting my foot down against binge eating. It was like, again, the critic would be like, this is unacceptable. I felt like the binge eating was this force that was controlling me. And I felt like a victim. I felt like I was in a cage, and it was this kind of like owning me. And I felt like every time I purged, it felt like me being like, no, like as if I was standing up for myself. Like, no more. This is the line in the sand. If that's going to happen, this is going to happen. Who I was talking to, I mean, is a therapy session, but there was this feeling of being victimized by binge eating. And this was a way that I asserted my autonomy and stood up. And I really did see it like that. And I can still relate to that feeling. But not understanding the way that these things intersected and how they were really two sides of the same oppression. And also, I remember believing I will stop purging as soon as I stop binge eating. Like, I will. And I knew that I would. I really would. But also not understanding how purging was fueling my binges, and they always did. And especially when I was using bulimia in the form of compensatory eating. So that was, I guess I don't really think about it like that, but that's what I was doing. I was binging and then absolutely making up for that I was calculating what it would take to make up to the point where I was fasting for like 3 days at a time, which I would get to like day 2.5 and then binge again. And then have to make up for double, and the time frames just kept extending until they became impossible. But I didn't understand. I thought that once I would stop binging, fine, I surrender then. And it's not the way it worked.
That's interesting, because that wasn't how I never felt like I was standing up for myself. It didn't feel like defiance. There's a lot written about bulimia and anger, but it didn't even feel like anger. It felt like collapse.
Oh, not to me.
Felt like giving up. But yes, for the longest time, I saw the binging was the problem. Of course, if I don't binge, I'm not going to purge. So therefore, and I think it's the dilemma of every bulimic. It's like, I need to just stop the binge eating, and then I won't purge if I'm not binging. And for me, it had to happen the other way around. Like, I tried and tried to keep both, but unfortunately, it just didn't work.
We love connecting with our listeners, so we host regular community events on Zoom. We also have a private Facebook group for our Patreon supporters. Please visit our website, lifeafterdietspodcast.com, to find out more.
For more details about how to contact us or to work with Sarah or Stef individually, please check out the show notes. Now let's get back to the episode. When was the last time for you, and did you know it was the last time?
I don't know that I remember the last time, like what it actually was. I think it was post the birth of my third daughter. But at that point, it was so infrequent, but it was an angry time. And I remember, it happened after the birth of my third daughter, because I remember thinking, I have 3 kids. And I was like, this is still, and I did it during pregnancies too. But I don't know. I don't remember quite what exactly it was. I think it was more fear. Actually, I think that time was more about clean eating. And I needed to get something out that I'd tainted my diet with.
For me, it felt there was something very addictive about it, which I didn't recognize at the time. It actually came to the forefront of my mind when I did my training with the National Centre for Eating Disorders, and we were learning about bulimia. they were talking about how purging actually releases endorphins in the brain. So the purging itself could be quite addictive. Now, I'd never put that together when I'd been purging. For me, the purging was always about trying to undo some of the binge. I never thought it was the purge and the release that I needed. That was only something I look back in hindsight. And I remember feeling really emotional when I heard that, because I just wished that I'd known that when I was struggling with bulimia. I wish that I'd understood, because that would have helped me to at least have understood why this felt like a behavior that I couldn't stop. Because the purging felt, many times it felt like as much of a choice or as little of a choice as the binge eating itself. The amount of times I said I wasn't going to do it anymore, I feel like there's something incredibly, again, I don't want to use the word addiction, but something pretty addicting about that cycle, which I never got with laxatives, or even, I mean, exercise brings a different kind of endorphin, and certainly a sense of feeling like I'd done a good job and I'd done the right thing by, working my body.
I don't know that I felt the addiction to it the way you did, and the way that I hear most people with bulimia talking about it. I remember there were periods of time where I would do it more often than not. I remember thinking, this is not good for me. But it was more about it was kind of like, yeah, but this is what you have to do to get rid of the amount you're binging. But I never felt like I was, maybe it's because I never felt like this is something I don't want to be doing. It was something that I thought was a good thing when I could do it. So I never felt like I was running away from it and couldn't. It would just sort of come in and out. And plus, I still always felt false about it. I still always felt like it wasn't, I don't know, like my real disorder was binging, and that was the real problem. And this was just this thing that I would sometimes do because I was desperate.
Just sitting here and talking about this, because of not something I talk about so much, there's just a few things. I was thinking about the physical experiences, the physical ramifications of purging on top of binging. And I had a memory come back of when I burst a blood vessel in my eye.
Yeah.
And walking around like that. And that feeling in my throat, like afterwards, that sort of dryness and pain and like insides aching. I don't really know where I'm going with this. I'm just taking a little trip down memory lane over here. It's fun.
And I remember bursting blood vessels in my face, like that they were all, my whole face got red. And I also remember there were periods in my life where I lived with other people, or I had roommates. I lived with family because whole long story. Like my family moved to Massachusetts and I stayed in New Jersey. I stayed with my aunt. And I remember my mom told my aunt to watch the toilet seat, like to watch for under that. That would be a sign. And I remember being confronted by people and saying, we found evidence that this is going on.
I was never caught. I never
No?
had to go through that. I was never caught. What I do remember, I remember a guy who I worked with saying to me once, because when my binge eating started, and I've spoken about this earlier in the podcast, I gained quite a bit of weight quite quickly. And so I looked very different in the space of a few months. And so people at work never said anything to me, but they were saying things to one another about it. And this friend of mine, this guy called Roger, I'm just going to name him, I don't care. He said to me that somebody had said to him that the reason why I'd gained all this weight was because I had stopped being bulimic. And I remember at the time, like the irony of that, because actually when I was at a lower weight was when I was okay with food and I wasn't struggling with an eating disorder. And when the binge eating and bulimia started, that's when I actually gained weight. But I also thought, like, this is kind of a side and not really very relevant to the podcast, but I thought, why tell me that? And I remember saying to him, I don't even want to know who it was. And he said, well, I wasn't going to tell you anyway. And then that just made me more annoyed. I was like,
yeah,
why are you telling me that? So I thought of that when you were mentioning like embarrassment or being confronted. It wasn't exactly being confronted, but it was people speculating about what was going on for me that was pretty mortifying.
It's funny because now my title is binge eating recovery coach. And I used to just call myself, but I had bulimia, or, like that was my calling card as far as like what my eating disorder was. I never would have called it binge eating disorder. I was too embarrassed about that. I had so much less shame saying I have bulimia, though. I was very careful not to call it binge eating disorder.
And I was the same when I started doing this work. I would always tell people I'm a eating disorder therapist until I started owning it, and now I own it and I'm okay with it. But it's still, even after recovery or during recovery or whatever, still was difficult to say. There was still that element of feeling shame that it was binge eating, or maybe even wasn't shame at that point, but it was fear of judgment and people not getting it. But now I kind of enjoy their confusion. I'm like, yeah, I work with binge eating, and the look on their faces, they try and figure out what that means. It's just it's fun, and I just let them. You know, I'm also conscious, I don't know if this episode was supposed to be about how to recover from bulimia, but we basically just had a little dump of our experience here. That's what we're about. We're about telling stories and resonance, but maybe we could talk a little bit about.
Yeah. I think for you, that question's relevant because you do explain that feeling of being addicted to it. So in that situation, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I think there's something about learning the connection between how purging can set you up for the next binge. And I don't mean learning the concept. I mean experientially learning that. And that paying attention and noticing, because I was able to let go of it when I could really see for myself how it wasn't doing what I hoped it was doing. And so for anybody who feels like it is doing what you want it to do, then there are potentially different questions to consider. Again, I felt the same as you. I was pissed off if anyone suggested that this was because of some other kind of emotional coping mechanism, because I really did feel like it was about the food. I think that bulimia can be a way of trying to release emotions when we don't feel like we've got another release. So I think someone's struggling with this, finding places to, or ways to, release emotions. And I mean, you mentioned exercise, but I think even to some people, certain emotions, giving them a voice. So being able to express them to yourself and maybe to another person, or be able to put that somewhere where people can hear it and validate it. I see so often those that are struggling with bulimia seem to really minimize their emotions and have had their emotions minimized as well. It's like, I'm supposed to be fine. And that idea of undoing the binge and the fear of weight gain, that's all the kind of stuff that we talk about elsewhere. And that's often something that somebody giving up bulimia may need to confront. I felt no victory in my bulimia recovery because I was still struggling with food. And I think that holds people stuck as well. They want to go from bulimia or any eating disorder into recovered, instead of that horrible gray place where you're not, you know, it's still messy, you're still obsessing about it, there's still a lot of guilt, there's all that going on, but you haven't got the validity of the eating disorder label. It's crossing that land afterwards that I think it feels like a pretty challenging journey to make, and it feels much more secure and safer to stay where you are.
Yeah. Yeah. I really, really hear that. It feels almost unbearable to give up purging, but still be dealing with the binge eating.
And I think that as well, for a lot of people with bulimia, recovery looks like a reduction in frequency for a while. It's not necessarily going from binging and purging, you stop. I think certainly for me, the reduction happened probably over a couple of years. It became less frequent, then there'd be a bout, and then there'd be longer gaps. So I think a harm reduction approach with bulimia is a good place to start, and then taking it that step further.
Yeah. I also think, not for everyone, because clearly this wasn't the case for you, but there can be themes of where else in life is there this feeling of being victimized or being not heard or not having autonomy, and where purging does feel, for anyone listening, where purging does feel like your voice of self, like you're standing up for yourself, that those are usually themes being played out elsewhere. And looking at that as well.
Do you know what can really help with emotions, though, that people might want to consider?
What?
Sometimes when you're feeling something, you don't know what to do with it, to do something that might help someone else. like rating and reviewing the podcast.
I got a query about it this morning that it's they're like, how do you even rate and review? But you have to scroll down. You have to scroll down the episode list, and then eventually the option pops up for anyone who has been dying to do that and just hasn't known how. 5 ladies. Nope.
5 ladies.
5
Nice.
stars. Nice ladies.
Nice
Worth
ladies.
a listen.
Worth a listen. 5 stars. Any order you like. We're not
Thanks
picky.
for listening. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Bye.
I don't like that one.
You don't like the ending, or you don't like the whole episode?
I don't know that I like the whole episode. I'm gonna have to listen to that one again.